The Extrath were a species of unparalleled intellect and peace, but now their civilization lay in ruins, scattered across a dying world. Their once lustrous cities, known throughout the galaxy for their harmonious architecture, were now nothing more than smouldering craters and twisted remnants of a bygone age. Their enemies, the Conqueror Alliance, were relentless in their pursuit of total annihilation, and the Extrath had no allies left to call upon. Every species they had helped, every race they had mediated peace for, had abandoned them in the face of a stronger foe. The survivors huddled in underground bunkers, hiding from orbital bombardments and the prowling forces of the Conquerors. Among them was Elder Kayla, the last of the Extrath's ruling council, a leader burdened with guilt and despair. She had watched her people's final stronghold fall, one by one, and now the planet was slipping into chaos. She was a woman of immense power, with the ability to manipulate the psionic energies that flowed through her species, but even she knew their time was running out. Desperation gnawed at her. She sat in the dimly lit control room of their central command bunker, her hands trembling as she typed a message into the old, barely functioning distress beacon. Her mind wandered to the alliances they had once nurtured, alliances that had now withered under the weight of fear and self-interest. She paused, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen. Who would answer? Who would dare face the might of the Conqueror Alliance? Then, in a moment of rare clarity, Kayla made her decision. She would send the call, not to the powerful, self-serving empires that had once pledged aid, but to a species they had never met, the humans. The galaxy had heard of their recent victories, their remarkable rise to prominence. It was said they were a resourceful species, adaptable and fiercely determined. Perhaps, just perhaps, they might be different. Her fingers hovered over the console. She had heard rumors that humanity had been neutral in the galaxy's struggles, watching, waiting, but never intervening. Would they listen? Would they risk everything for a race that had nothing left to give but gratitude? There was no time left for hesitation. Kayla sent the signal. A few hours later, Captain Jack Monroe of the United Earth Fleet sat at his desk, his fingers moving absent-mindedly over a digital tablet. His thoughts were far from the usual bureaucratic reports that filled his inbox. Humanity's political and military leaders had been growing increasingly weary of interstellar conflict, focusing more on securing resources and consolidating power. That was until a high-priority message came through, an urgent distress call for a race named the Extrath. The message was short, almost a whisper in the sea of galactic chatter. But something in it resonated with Monroe. The plea for help carried a weight, one that humans, for all their flaws, could not ignore. Monroe leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the transmission. "We have nothing left. We have been abandoned by all. Please, if you can hear us, we are your last hope." The choice was clear. Monroe hit a button on his console, summoning the commanders of the United Earth Fleet. It was time to answer the call. Captain Jack Monroe sat at the head of a large holographic table aboard the flagship US Vanguard. Around him, a diverse group of officers stood ready for their briefing. He didn't have to say much. The urgency in the transmission was all they needed to hear. The Extrath, a species teetering on the brink of extinction, were reaching out to them. Their message was a stark one. Humanity was their last hope. "Admiral Monroe," said Commander Elise Grant, a no-nonsense officer with the tactical division. "We're talking about a species that has been abandoned by the entire galaxy. We can't even begin to imagine how dire their situation must be. But why us? Why did they choose us over the other races?" Monroe leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I'm not sure," he said, his voice quiet. "But we're the only ones left who could make a difference. For whatever reason, they decided to reach out. And as far as I'm concerned, we're going to answer that call." Grant nodded, her expression grim. "And the Conquerors. Are we prepared for that?" "We'll deal with them when we get there," Monroe replied. "Our primary mission is to provide immediate aid, stabilize their situation, and get them out of harm's way. If we can stop the Conquerors from finishing what they started, then we will. But we'll need to move fast." He turned to Lieutenant Lucas Haynes, the fleet's chief strategist, a sharp mind known for his ability to read a battlefield before it even began. "What's our approach, Haynes?" "We move quickly," Haynes said, his fingers already flicking through data on his terminal. "The X-Wrath are deep into their home system. It'll be hard to get in unnoticed, especially with Conqueror ships swarming their planet. We'll have to establish a strong presence first, hit them with everything we've got. Once we've disrupted their forces, we can evacuate any survivors and secure the planet." Monroe nodded. "Good. We're going to need a multi-pronged approach. The Vanguard will lead the assault, but I'm going to send a few of our other ships ahead. We'll split our fleet into two. One group will assist the X-Wrath. The other will keep the Conqueror forces distracted long enough for us to make our move." The officers around the table exchanged glances, understanding the risks involved, but no one voiced doubt. They had all seen the kind of resolve that humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. Monroe knew that the crew was ready for this. They weren't just going to fight for their own survival, they were going to fight for someone else's. Monroe stood, his face hardening. "Get to your stations. We leave in 30 minutes. This isn't just a mission. This is an opportunity. An opportunity to show the galaxy who we are and what we stand for." As his officers filed out of the briefing room, Monroe stared out the viewport at the stars ahead. A part of him wondered if they were walking into a trap, if the X-Wrath were truly as desperate as they seemed. But the message had been clear. Humanity had the chance to do something that no one else would. And that, he thought, was worth fighting for. The journey to the X-Wrath homeworld was brief but tense. The crew of the Vanguard could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on them, and the mood aboard the flagship was somber as they neared the coordinates. There was no turning back now. Captain Monroe stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the tactical display. The X-Wrath's planet, once a jewel of the galaxy, was barely recognizable now. The atmosphere was choked with debris from orbital bombardments, and the remnants of shattered cities glowed with the dying light of fires that had raged for weeks. The entire system was in a state of chaos. "Sir, incoming transmission from the X-Wrath," announced Lieutenant Sarah Velasquez, the communications officer. Monroe turned to face the holographic projection of Elder Kayla, a tall, lithe figure with translucent skin that glimmered faintly in the dim light of the bridge. Her eyes were filled with a mix of desperation and hope. "Captain Monroe," she said, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion, "we are ready to receive your fleet. But I must warn you, our enemies are already here. The Conqueror fleet has already deployed attack forces in orbit. You may not have the time you think you do." "Understood," Monroe replied, his voice firm. "We'll initiate a counteroffensive. We'll draw their attention away from your position, but you need to evacuate immediately. Our primary goal is to get your people off the planet and into hiding." Kayla's expression softened, a flicker of gratitude crossing her features. "You are our last hope, Captain. We will do what we can." The transmission cut off, and Monroe's face hardened. He could already see the Conqueror ships in the distance, their massive silhouettes growing larger as they advanced toward the X-Wrath's decimated world. "All hands, prepare for battle," Monroe commanded. "We're going in." The Vanguard's engines roared as it surged toward the Exrath homeworld, flanked by two smaller Earth warships, the US Resolute and the US Elysium. The Conqueror fleet, a much larger force, was already in position, their ships lined up like a predatory formation. The Conqueror vessels were heavily armed, with imposing hulls and weapons that glowed with malicious intent. Monroe studied the Conqueror fleet's layout. They were organized, but their arrogance was evident. They hadn't expected humans to show up. It was a mistake he planned to exploit. "Haynes," Monroe barked, "divert all available power to the forward shields. We're going straight in." "Got it, Captain," said Haynes, his fingers flying over his console. "Weapons are primed. We're ready to engage." The first shot came from the Vanguard, a brilliant burst of blue energy that streaked across the void and slammed into the closest Conqueror ship. It staggered under the impact, its shields flaring brightly as the Vanguard pivoted to unleash a second barrage. The Conqueror ships immediately retaliated, their weapons lighting up like fireworks in the blackness of space. The Vanguard rocked under the initial blasts, but its reinforced hull held steady. Monroe's face was grim, but there was no hesitation in his command. "Stay on them. Keep up the pressure," he shouted, as the Vanguard weaved between the incoming fire. The Resolute and Elysium followed suit, engaging with precision. But the Conquerors were no fools. They adapted quickly, focusing their fire on the smaller human ships. The Elysium was hit hard, her shields failing under the bombardment, sending shockwaves through the entire fleet. "Status on the Elysium?" Monroe demanded, his voice tight. "Severe damage to their engines, Captain," reported Lieutenant Velasquez. "They're holding, but they won't last much longer." Monroe gritted his teeth. The battle was already taking a heavy toll, but they couldn't afford to retreat. The Exrath were depending on them. "Haynes, let's draw their attention," Monroe ordered. "Lock onto the largest Conqueror ship and target its engine core. If we can cripple their command vessel, we might have a chance." Haynes nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Aye, Captain. Targeting now." The Vanguard fired another devastating volley, this time aimed directly at the heart of the Conqueror flagship. The shot hit home, and the massive enemy ship staggered, its engines flaring in a massive explosion. The Conquerors faltered, their coordination temporarily disrupted. The momentary advantage was enough for the Vanguard and the other human ships to reposition, hammering the remaining Conqueror forces with renewed ferocity. But as the Conqueror fleet began to withdraw, the Elysium was already lost. The ship's hull split open, and debris scattered into the void. Monroe clenched his fist, knowing that even this victory came at a terrible price. "Let's get the Exrath out of here," Monroe said, his voice cold with resolve. "We bought them time, but it's not over." The Vanguard and the remaining ships began to maneuver toward the Exrath's underground bunkers, ready to evacuate the survivors. But even as the last Conqueror ship retreated, Monroe knew they had just started down a path that would demand even greater sacrifices. The aftermath of the battle was a mix of relief and sorrow. The Conquerors had retreated, but the cost was steep. The Elysium was gone, and several other human ships had taken heavy damage. The Vanguard, though intact, was in desperate need of repairs. Yet, despite the losses, the immediate task was clear: getting the Exrath to safety. Monroe stood in the command center of the Vanguard, watching as the battered fleet gathered just outside the planet's orbit. The Exrath had begun to emerge from their hidden bunkers, cautiously watching the humans as they approached. Despite the initial signs of gratitude, there was still a palpable tension in the air, an unspoken wariness. Elder Kayla appeared again on the bridge's holoscreen, her holographic form standing tall and composed, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the situation. She had lost so much already. The Extrath were a species of diplomats, of thinkers, not warriors. And yet, after years of unprovoked violence, their people were learning the harsh realities of survival. "Captain Monroe," she said, her voice laced with a quiet strength. "We owe you and your people a debt we can never repay, but we must act quickly. The Conqueror fleet has already retreated, but their allies will be back soon. And even if we escape today, there will be no safe haven for us unless we find a way to fight back." Monroe could see the flicker of fear behind her composed demeanour. Kayla was a leader, but even she was shaken. He had seen the toll war took on even the strongest leaders. "We'll get you to safety," Monroe said, his tone firm but understanding. "We'll help you rebuild. But we need to know something. What can we do to help you fight back against the Conquerors? You said something earlier about psionics." Kayla hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Our people have always been capable of manipulating the energies of the mind. It is not a power we ever used for war, but in the current situation, it may be our only chance. However, even those of us who possess this ability have not been trained for combat. We need guidance." Monroe exchanged a look with Lieutenant Maya Alvarez, the fleet's top precision and combat specialist. Maya, though hesitant, understood the gravity of the situation. She had trained with some of Earth's most powerful telepaths, and had always been skeptical about the potential of non-humans when it came to psionics. But the Extrath had been a peaceful species for millennia. If they could harness their powers, they could become an indispensable ally. "Lieutenant Alvarez," Monroe said, turning toward her, "I need you to assess the Extrath's abilities. Train them as much as you can in the next 48 hours. We can't afford to waste time." Maya nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "I'll do what I can, Captain, but they're not soldiers. I don't know if they can adapt quickly enough to help us in the field." Kayla's expression softened. "We are not warriors, Captain Monroe, but we will fight if it means saving our people. We will do what is necessary." Monroe knew this alliance was fragile. He'd seen alliances forged under desperation before, but they had always been based on mutual interest. This was different. The Extrath had nothing left but their hope, and that hope was now tied to humanity. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the road ahead. Their enemies were brutal, relentless, and far better prepared for war. But Monroe's gut told him that the Extrath had something the Conquerors couldn't anticipate: the will to survive. "Understood," Monroe said, his voice steady. "We'll make this work. Humanity and the Extrath will stand together, or we'll fall together." As he turned back to the war map on the bridge, his mind was already moving to the next phase of the mission. They had bought time for the Extrath, but time was running out. The Conquerors wouldn't stay away for long. It would take every ounce of humanity's resolve and the Extrath's newfound determination to hold the line. But for the first time in a long while, Monroe felt something he hadn't in years: hope. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other. The next 2 days were a blur of training, strategy sessions, and tense moments. The Vanguard was still in orbit around the Extrath homeworld, its crew working non-stop to repair damage and prepare for the next phase. Monroe had ordered an emergency fleet-wide restructuring. Though they had pushed the Conquerors back, this war was far from over. The Extrath needed time, but time was the one thing they didn't have. On the lower decks, Lieutenant Maya Alvarez spent every available moment with the Extrath. She was skeptical at first. Her military experience had always emphasized physical training, strategy, and tech. She didn't believe the Exrath, peaceful by nature, could adapt to the brutal demands of combat so quickly. But after only a few hours working with Elder Kayla and the Exrath's psionic warriors, she realized how wrong she'd been. Kayla's people were receptive, eager to learn. The raw potential in them was undeniable. It wasn't just about telekinesis or telepathy. They were attuned to the unseen forces of the universe in ways humans couldn't comprehend. Kayla and her top students could already manipulate energy fields, creating shields strong enough to withstand human blaster fire. Others had begun experimenting with more offensive applications, projecting bursts of kinetic force and manipulating gravitational waves. Maya had started the training with skepticism, but now she was a believer. These Exrath weren't simply learning. They were evolving, adapting to the demands of war faster than she had ever expected. But the most surprising thing was the connection she felt with them. Their psionic abilities weren't just a tool, they were a part of who they were. They felt each other's pain, fear, and hope, and the more they trained, the more of their bond strengthened. Focus. Maya instructed, watching as Kayla's young protege, Nedra, struggled to maintain a psychic shield while also attacking with psionic force. You need to find balance. Control is everything. Nadra nodded, sweat beading on her forehead, and for a moment, Maya wondered what it must be like to have that kind of power coursing through your veins, power that could shape reality itself. Outside the training rooms, the rest of the crew was focused on preparation. Commander Grant worked tirelessly with the Vanguard's engineering team, ensuring the fleet was ready for the next engagement. The Exrath were being outfitted with human gear, basic armor, weapons, and communication equipment, but the real force multiplier would be their psionics. Monroe had made it clear that the Exrath's abilities would be the key to turning the tide. After the second day of intense training, the Exrath were ready for combat. At least, that's what Maya hoped. They were inexperienced, untested in real battle, but they had something no one else did: a desperate will to survive, and the ability to manipulate forces that few in the galaxy could understand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The countdown to the next Conqueror assault began. Intelligence reports indicated that the Conquerors were regrouping, preparing a retaliatory strike to finish what they had started. And this time, they would not underestimate the humans and their new allies. Monroe gathered his officers for the final briefing. The room was filled with the weight of impending battle, but also a sense of grim determination. The Conquerors won't give us mercy, and they won't stop until they've wiped out the Exrath. But we've shown them once what we're capable of, Monroe said, his voice steady. Now we show them what we can do when we fight together. The Exrath have the power we need. It's time to use it. He turned to Kayla, standing tall next to Maya. You're ready, Kayla. We need you at the front lines with us. Kayla nodded, her face calm, but resolute. We will not fail. Monroe looked over his officers, then at the Exrath who stood among them, their eyes burning with a new purpose. This was no longer just about survival, it was about something bigger. It was about forging an alliance that could push back against the darkness spreading through the galaxy. It was about fighting for a future that was worth living for. As the briefing ended and the crew dispersed, Monroe remained standing for a moment, staring out the viewport. The stars ahead shimmered like distant promises. The war was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a surge of hope. With the Exrath at their side, humanity might just have a chance. The Vanguard and its allied ships dropped out of warp and arrived at the coordinates where the Conqueror fleet was expected. The Exrath had helped refine the intelligence. Their psionic senses had given them insight into the enemy's movements and tactics. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they could hope for. Monroe stood on the bridge, his knuckles white against the armrest as he studied the tactical display. The Conqueror fleet was large, larger than the last time they'd fought, but it wasn't just their numbers that concerned him. It was their method of attack. The Conquerors had a reputation for overwhelming force, and from what they'd learned, this time they weren't just sending ships. They had a weapon, a massive mobile battle station capable of crippling an entire fleet in minutes. "We've got about 20 minutes before they're in range," Haynes, the strategist, reported. "We can't afford to engage them head-on this time. We need to disrupt their formation first, isolate their key vessels, and then go for their command station." Monroe nodded. "We'll split the fleet again. The Vanguard and the Resolute will draw their attention. The rest of the ships will go for the battle station." He turned to Elder Kayla and Lieutenant Maya Alvarez, both of whom stood nearby, ready to fight. "Kayla, we'll need you to focus on their flagship. The battle station is heavily shielded, but it won't hold if we take down their command ship. Can your people target their systems?" Kayla's eyes flickered with determination, and she raised her hand slightly. "We can disrupt their communications and targeting systems. We will do what we can, Captain." Maya stepped forward, her face grim. "The Extrath can manipulate their own energy fields, but they haven't had enough practice in real combat. If they're going to target something as sophisticated as the Conqueror's flagship, they'll need time to focus. It's risky." Monroe didn't hesitate. "Then we give them that time." The crew moved into action. The battle plan was set, but nothing could have prepared them for the scale of the enemy force that loomed ahead. Conqueror ships, their massive black hulls silhouetted against the backdrop of stars, began to converge. Their weapons flickered to life, and the first barrage of plasma fire lit up the void. "Brace for impact," Monroe shouted. The Vanguard rocked as the first wave of shots hit their shields, the force shaking the entire ship. Monroe gritted his teeth, eyes fixed on the advancing enemy. "Return fire. Target their command ship now." The Vanguard and Resolute fired in tandem, their powerful cannons cutting through the dark as they closed in on the enemy. The Conquerors responded with a hail of fire, but the humans had the advantage of speed and maneuverability. They weaved through enemy fire, drawing the Conqueror ships into a tighter formation. Meanwhile, in the heart of the battle, the Elysium's sister ship, the Courageous, took a heavy hit. Its hull groaned and cracked under the strain. Monroe's heart clenched, but there was no time for sentiment. They had to hold the line. At the rear of the fleet, the Extrath warriors, now clad in basic human combat suits, floated in the vacuum of space as psionic waves erupted around them. Nadra, Kayla's protege, was the first to reach out, her mind extending like a ripple through the ether, brushing against the Conqueror fleet's command structure. For a moment, there was silence. Then the first of the Conqueror ships dropped out of formation. The attack was swift, surgical. Nadra had focused on their shields, weak points in their defences now exposed. "Now," Kayla's voice rang out, a command in both the physical and psychic realms. Her psionic powers flared to life as she and the other Extrath warriors amplified their mental strength. The Vanguard's targeting systems aligned perfectly, and a devastating shot from the human fleet's weapons struck the Conqueror flagship dead-on, sending it spinning out of control. "One down," Haynes shouted. But just as victory seemed in sight, the Conqueror battle station activated, its massive energy weapons charging. A shockwave rippled through the fleet as the station's cannon powered up, aiming directly for the Vanguard. Incoming. Alvarez screamed, her eyes wide. The Vanguard dodged at the last moment, but the massive energy pulse grazed its shields, sending sparks across the bridge. The ship shuddered violently, and Monroe was thrown against the console. Blood dripped from his forehead, but he didn't have time to check. Helm. Evasive maneuvers, he barked, struggling to his feet. Maya was at his side instantly, her eyes wild. We can't take another hit like that. We need to take down that battle station, now. Monroe's mind raced. If they didn't finish the battle station, they would all be wiped out. But the Vanguard couldn't take many more hits. The fleet was already spread thin. He turned to Kayla. Can you disrupt their weapons long enough for us to finish this? Kayla nodded, her face etched with concentration. We will try. The moment felt like an eternity as Kayla and the Extrath focused their psionic energy on the massive weapon systems of the Conqueror battle station. Slowly, the glowing weapons flickered, their energy readings destabilizing. Now! Monroe shouted, slamming his fist into the command console. The Vanguard fired everything it had, a volley of coordinated shots that pierced the weakening defenses of the battle station. In a brilliant explosion, the station detonated, sending a shockwave through space. The battle was won, but the cost was high. As the smoke cleared and the last of the Conqueror ships retreated, Monroe's heart sank. The Extrath had proven their worth, but this victory had come at a steep price, one that would reverberate long after the battle was over. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of Conqueror ships, their blackened hulks drifting in the cold vacuum of space. The once imposing Conqueror battle station, now a cloud of debris, had been reduced to a scattering of twisted metal and charred fragments. For a brief moment, victory seemed complete, but as the human fleet regrouped, a sinking feeling settled over Captain Monroe. The Vanguard was heavily damaged. Shields were down to 20%, and several key systems were on the brink of failure. The Resolute and Courageous had suffered similarly, both ships limping through space on barely functional thrusters. The cost of the battle was evident in every corner of the fleet. Damage report. Monroe barked as he stepped onto the bridge, his voice raw from the strain. He still had a cut across his brow from the last explosion, but his focus was unshakable. Lieutenant Sarah Velasquez, the communications officer, turned to him. We've lost the Courageous. She's gone, Captain. Resolute is holding, but their engines are damaged, and the crew is reporting casualties. We're down to about half our fleet's strength. Monroe clenched his jaw. There had been too many losses, too many sacrifices, but he pushed those thoughts aside. And the Extrath. Elder Kayla's group is safe, Velasquez replied. They've taken casualties too. Several of their warriors are injured, but they're stable for now. Monroe nodded, exhaling slowly. Despite the damage, the Extrath had proven invaluable. Their psionic powers had disrupted the Conqueror forces, buying humanity precious moments to deliver the final blow to the battle station. But the victory felt hollow. The Conquerors weren't going to stop after a single defeat. They had more ships, more firepower, and Monroe knew this was just the beginning. He turned to Commander Elise Grant, his tactical officer, who had been coordinating the fleet's movements during the chaos. She looked just as exhausted as he felt, her eyes bloodshot but unwavering. Grant, what's the status on the Conqueror fleet? Any signs of regrouping? Yes, Captain, Grant replied, her voice tight. Their retreat was tactical, not a full withdrawal. They've pulled back to a nearby system, and I'm detecting several jump signatures. It's only a matter of time before they're back with reinforcements. Monroe cursed under his breath. They didn't have the luxury of time. The Conquerors would return, and this time they wouldn't be caught off guard. Kayla's image flickered to life on the holoscreen. She looked worn, her translucent skin duller than usual, but her eyes burned with the fire of determination. "Captain Monroe, our warriors are ready. We can help you fight again." Monroe met her gaze, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "We can't afford another battle like this, Kayla. We need to regroup, reinforce, and make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. Your people have fought bravely, but we can't ask them to keep pushing at this pace. Rest, recovery, everyone needs it." Kayla nodded slowly. "I understand. But know this, Captain, we will fight as long as it takes. The Conquerors will not have our world or our people." Her words hit Monroe like a punch to the gut. The ex-Shrath had suffered, lost so much in this war already, and still they stood firm. He could only hope that humanity's resolve was just as unyielding. The bridge fell into a heavy silence as Monroe surveyed the tactical screen again. His thoughts churned. The ex-Shrath needed more time to fully recover, but if the Conquerors returned with reinforcements, there might not be enough time to save them. The pressure was mounting on every front, strategically, personally, and emotionally. "Haynes," Monroe said, turning toward his strategist, "I want a full analysis of the Conqueror fleet's capabilities. If they've got reinforcements on the way, we need to know what we're up against." "Aye, Captain," Haynes replied, already at work on his terminal. Monroe stared out at the vast emptiness of space. This war had taken its toll, but there was no time for mourning. They had to keep pushing, keep fighting. Every second counted. The survival of the ex-Shrath and humanity itself hung in the balance. He finally turned back to the crew. "Prepare for the worst, everyone. We may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. We fight together, or we fall together. No retreat, no surrender." The hours following the battle were the longest Monroe had ever endured. The fleet limped back into the outskirts of the ex-Shrath home system, battered and bloodied but alive. The Vanguard was in no condition to fight again without extensive repairs, and the rest of the fleet was in a similar state. Yet, as the ships docked in their temporary refuge, a sense of grim determination hung in the air. No one was giving up. Not now. Monroe sat in his quarters, staring at the holographic star map before him. The Conquerors had pulled back, but they weren't done. They were regrouping, building a force powerful enough to crush any resistance in their path. The question now was whether they could be stopped before they reached the ex-Shrath homeworld. "Captain Monroe, you need to get some rest." A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Commander Elise Grant, her voice firm, but laced with concern. She stepped into the room, her face drawn with exhaustion. Monroe didn't look up immediately. Rest? After what just happened? "I'm not going to sleep until I know what we're up against, Elise." "You can't fight a war on fumes," Grant countered, crossing the room and standing beside him. "We all need to regroup, or we'll burn out before the next battle even starts." He sighed, rubbing his temples. She was right, but the weight of responsibility was crushing. The lives of his crew, the ex-Shrath, the entire future of both species, he couldn't afford to falter now. "Have we heard from the ex-Shrath yet?" he asked, finally meeting her gaze. "Yes, Kayla and her council have been in contact. They're willing to mobilize their full forces, but they're not ready for another fight this soon," Grant said. "They need time to recover. The psionics have taken a toll, even on their strongest. They can't keep pushing themselves like this. If we go in too soon, we risk everything." Monroe leaned back, staring at the star map. His mind raced. The Conquerors were coming, and they were bringing more ships, more firepower. They couldn't afford to wait too long, but he understood Kayla's point. The Exrath were vital to the fight, and they needed to be at their full strength. "We don't have time," Monroe said at last. "If we wait for the Exrath to recover fully, the Conquerors will crush us before we even have a chance to counter. We need to make a stand now, but we can't do it alone." Grant studied him, her brow furrowed. "You're thinking of reinforcements from Earth, aren't you?" Monroe nodded. "I'll send a message to Command. We need more ships, more firepower. Earth has resources. If we can get reinforcements, we might be able to hold the line until the Exrath are ready. But we're going to have to risk it. No more delays." Grant hesitated, but then she nodded. "I'll start organizing the signal. We'll need to act quickly, or Earth won't make it in time." Monroe stood up, feeling the weight of his decision. There were no guarantees, only the desperate hope that Earth's forces could make it in time. The Conquerors were ruthless, and every moment they waited gave the enemy more time to prepare. He wasn't sure how long the Exrath could hold out, but if they couldn't, humanity had to be ready to step in and take the fight to the Conquerors. "We'll make it work," Monroe said firmly. "Prepare the fleet for what comes next. We'll keep pushing until Earth gets here." Outside, the stars gleamed like distant promises, but Monroe's heart was heavy. The war was far from over, and the next battle could very well decide the fate of everything.